On March 14, 1879, 3 farmers breaking ground for spring planting in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, heard something that made their blood run cold. A muffled screaming coming from beneath the earth itself when they followed the sound to a freshly disturbed patch of soil near an abandoned homestead. They found a man's hand protruding from the dirt, fingers still moving, clawing desperately at the packed earth above. What they pulled from that makeshift grave was barely recognizable as human, covered in soil, eyes wild with terror, unable to form coherent words. The man they rescued was Silas Cunningham, a local farmer who had been missing for 3 days. And when the county sheriff finally extracted his confession about who had put him in that ground and why, the testimony revealed a family secret so disturbing that the court transcripts were sealed for decades. 3 sons born of the same bloodline, twisted back on itself through generations, had decided their father's punishment for sins no one outside that isolated farmhouse could fully comprehend. Before we descend into one of Pennsylvania's darkest chapters, I need you to do something. If you're listening from Pennsylvania or anywhere these hidden American tragedies unfolded, leave a comment telling me what state you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about family isolation and what happens when bloodlines turn in on themselves for too long. The story of the Cunningham family begins not with violence, but with silence, the kind that settles over a place when terrible secrets become ordinary facts of life. Clearfield County in 1,179 occupied a harsh stretch of central Pennsylvania, where the Allegheny Plateau met endless forests of pine and hardwood. The county had been settled primarily by Scots, Irish, and German immigrants in the late 1700s, families seeking cheap land and isolation from the coastal cities they'd left behind. By the time of our story, Clearfield contained roughly 20,000 souls scattered across 900 square miles of rugged terrain. Mining towns clustered around coal deposits, logging camps that appeared and vanished with the seasons, and isolated farmsteads where families lived weeks of travel from their nearest neighbors. The Cunningham homestead sat in the northwestern corner of the county along a rooted wagon road that connected the mining settlement of Oyola Mills to the lumber town of Phillipsburg. The property itself comprised 80 acres of marginal land, rocky soil that fought every attempt at cultivation, steep hillsides covered in second-growth timber, a creek that ran strong in spring but dried to a trickle by August. The farmhouse was a two-story structure built sometime in the 1820s, constructed from local timber that had weathered to a dark gray. 2 small windows on each floor, a fieldstone chimney on the north side, a sagging front porch, and a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house. Silas Cunningham was 57 years old in 1879, though he looked a decade older. Years of hard labor had bent his frame. Arthritis gnarled his hands, and a lifetime of poor nutrition had left him gaunt and hollowed. He stood barely 5'1/2" ft tall, thin as a fence post, with lank brown hair going gray, and a beard he trimmed irregularly with sheep shears. His clothing consisted of homespun wool trousers held up with rope suspenders, a stained cotton shirt, and boots he'd resolved himself multiple times with leather scavenged from dead livestock. But Silas's physical appearance was unremarkable compared to his 3 sons. And it was the sons who made travelers avoid the Cunningham farm, who made neighboring families cross themselves when the Cunningham name was mentioned, who made the county sheriff uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The eldest son was named Josiah, aged 31 in 1879. He stood just under 6 feet tall, but walked with a severe stoop that made him appear shorter. His head was oddly shaped, too long from front to back, almost egg-like, with a prominent sloping forehead and a receding chin. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, sat too far apart on his face, giving him a vacant expression that some mistook for simple-mindedness. His hands were disproportionately large for his frame, the knuckles swollen and red, fingers that never quite straightened. He rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, and when he did, his voice emerged thick and slurred as if his tongue was too large for his mouth. The middle son, Caleb, was 28 lib. He was shorter than Josiah by several inches, barrel-chested and thick-limbed, with the kind of brute strength that comes from a lifetime of heavy labor. But his face told a different story, features that seemed slightly off-center, one eye noticeably higher than the other, ears that protruded at odd angles, a mouth that hung perpetually open, revealing teeth that grew and crowded and crooked. He had a nervous habit of rocking back and forth when standing still, a rhythmic motion that was unsettling to watch. His speech was better than Josiah's, but he struggled with certain sounds, substituting simpler consonants when complex ones defeated him. The youngest son, Nehemiah, was 24. He was the smallest of the three, barely 5'4" in, but his body was corded with muscle developed from compensating for his stature. His face showed the most obvious signs of what the local doctor would later describe in his testimony as degenerative hereditary conditions. A severe underbite that left his lower teeth protruding beyond his upper lip, a nose that appeared flattened and spread too wide across his face, ears that were small and malformed. But unlike his brothers, Nehemiah's eyes held a sharp intelligence, a calculating awareness that made him more unsettling than his physically larger siblings. He was the one who managed what little business the farm conducted with the outside world, the one who spoke for the family on the rare occasions they encountered neighbors. The origins of the Cunningham family's isolation began 2 generations earlier in the 1820s, when Silas's grandfather Ezra had purchased the land and built the farmhouse. Ezra had arrived in Pennsylvania from somewhere back east. Accounts varied on whether he came from New York or New Jersey, bringing with him a wife and 2 young children. But Ezra's wife had died during their first winter on the property, and Ezra had raised his children, a son named Josiah, the elder, and a daughter named Rebecca, alone in that isolated farmhouse. What happened next was whispered about, but never openly discussed. Ezra never remarried. His daughter Rebecca never left the farm to marry, and when Josiah, the elder, reached adulthood, he too remained on the property. Parish records from the local Lutheran church showed only one marriage recorded for the Cunningham family. Josiah, the elder, marrying Rebecca in 1832. The marriage certificate listed them as Josiah Cunningham and Rebecca Cunningham, but made no mention that they were brother and sister. Silas had been born of that union in 1822, along with 2 siblings who died in infancy. When Silas reached adulthood, he married a woman named Martha Yoda, daughter of a German immigrant family from the next county over. The marriage produced 3 sons, Josiah, Caleb, and Nehemiah. But Martha died in 1858, when Nehemiah was only 3 years old under circumstances that were never fully explained. The local doctor who examined her body noted in his records only unexplained wasting and failure to thrive. After Martha's death, Silas raised his 3 sons alone as his father had before him. The boys grew up in near total isolation, rarely traveling beyond the boundaries of their property, educated only by their father's limited literacy, socialized only within their own family unit. The farm provided barely enough to sustain them, a few pigs, some chickens, a struggling vegetable garden, occasional hunting in the surrounding forests. By the 1870s, the Cunningham farm had developed a reputation in the county as a place to avoid. Travelers on the wagon road reported seeing the 3 sons working in the fields, their odd appearances and strange behaviors making even hardened frontiersmen uncomfortable. Stories circulated about the Cunningham boys that they spoke their own language, that they engaged in unnatural practices, that they had been seen performing disturbing rituals in the woods. Most of these stories were exaggerations born of fear and misunderstanding, but they contained enough truth to make people wary. The nearest neighbors, the Hofmeister family, lived 2 miles south on a more prosperous farm. Wilhelm Hofmeister occasionally encountered Silas or one of the sons at the general store in Akola Mills, transactions that were always brief and uncomfortable. Hofmeister later testified that he had offered to help the Cunninghams multiple times over the years, assistance with harvest, loans of equipment, invitations to social gatherings, but had always been rebuffed with refusals. The winter of 1878-1879 was particularly harsh in central Pennsylvania. Snow began falling in November and continued through March, accumulating in drifts that made the wagon roads impossible for weeks at a time. The Cunningham farm, already isolated, became completely cut off from the outside world. Supplies that should have been purchased in autumn ran short. The livestock, poorly sheltered, began dying off. And in that farmhouse, with 4 men trapped together in close quarters for months, something broke. The sequence of events leading to Silas Cunningham's burial began on the morning of March 11, 1879. Though the tensions that exploded that day had been building throughout the winter, the household had fallen into a pattern of increasing hostility. Silences that stretched for days, meals eaten without conversation, each man retreating into his own thoughts and resentments. The immediate trigger, according to Silas's later testimony, was a dispute over food rationing. The winter had depleted their stores faster than anticipated. By early March, their diet consisted primarily of cornmeal mush, occasional salt pork from their dwindling supply, and little else. Silas, as patriarch of the family, controlled the distribution of what remained. On March 11th, when Caleb complained that his portion was insufficient, Silas responded harshly, asserting his authority in language that Caleb found demeaning. The argument escalated quickly. Caleb, frustrated by months of confinement and hunger, pushed back against his father's authority in ways he never had before. Josiah, usually passive, sided with his brother. Nehemiah, the most articulate of the 3, verbalized grievances that had apparently festered for years about their isolation, their poverty, their father's rigid control over every aspect of their lives. What emerged during the confrontation was a litany of accusations that suggested a household ruled by fear and arbitrary punishment. The sons claimed Silas had beaten them regularly throughout their childhood and continued to threaten violence even now that they were grown men. They accused him of deliberately keeping them isolated, preventing them from seeking wives or establishing their own households, maintaining control through emotional manipulation and threats of abandonment. Silas, for his part, insisted he had done only what was necessary to hold the family together, to maintain their property, to prevent outsiders from discovering family secrets that would bring shame and legal consequences. The nature of those secrets wasn't fully articulated during the argument, but the implications were clear. The sons knew about the incestuous relationship that had produced their father, understood that their own unusual appearances and mental difficulties likely stemmed from generations of inbreeding, feared that exposure would lead to their institutionalization or worse. The argument continued through the morning and into the afternoon. Voices rising, old wounds reopened, decades of resentment spilling out in that cramped farmhouse. At some point, the sons began coordinating with each other through glances and subtle gestures, a language developed over years of living in such close quarters. Nehemiah, the cleverest, seemed to be orchestrating something, though exactly what remained unclear. By evening, the confrontation had reached a critical point. Silas, exhausted by hours of argument and perhaps sensing genuine danger, attempted to end the dispute by retreating to his bedroom on the 2nd floor, but the sons followed, blocking his path, preventing his withdrawal. The physical confrontation that followed was described by Silas in his testimony as a confusion of hands and bodies, 3 men overwhelming one, pushing him back down the stairs, forcing him out the front door into the cold March night. Silas was not dressed for outdoor exposure. He wore only his indoor clothing, no coat, no hat, no gloves. The temperature hovered around freezing and a light snow was falling. He pleaded with his sons to let him back inside, but they refused, barring the door. Through the window, he could see them conferring, their expressions suggesting they were making decisions about his fate. What happened next defied comprehension until much later. The 3 sons emerged from the house carrying shovels, rope, and a canvas tarpaulin. They forced Silas, at this point too cold and frightened to resist effectively, toward a section of ground behind the root cellar where the earth was softer, less frozen than the surrounding soil, and there, working by lamplight, they began digging. Silas initially believed they were preparing to bury him after killing him, that the digging was simply preparation for disposal of his body. But as the pit deepened to about 4 ft, he realized something more horrifying. They weren't going to kill him first. They intended to bury him alive, to leave him conscious in the ground, aware and suffering, a punishment that exceeded simple murder in its cruelty. The sons worked efficiently, methodically, as if they had planned this. When the pit was ready, they forced Silas into it, pushing him down until he lay at the bottom, too weak and cold to climb out on his own. Then they wrapped him loosely in the tarpaulin, not to comfort him, but to prevent dirt from immediately suffocating him, to ensure he would live for some time beneath the earth. Nehemiah explained their reasoning in words Silas would later repeat to authorities. Their father had buried them, buried their potential, their futures, their chances at normal lives, through his actions and the blood shame he had passed down to them. Now he would experience that burial literally, would understand what it meant to be trapped without escape, would have time to contemplate his sins before the earth claimed him permanently. The covering of the grave began around 9:00 that evening. The sons shoveled dirt slowly, deliberately, giving Silas time to understand what was happening, to feel each layer of soil, adding weight above him. They left a small air pocket near his face, enough to sustain him temporarily, and position the tarpaulin to prevent immediate collapse of earth onto his body. The final layer was packed down firmly, making the site appear like recently disturbed ground rather than an obvious grave. Before returning to the house, the sons stood over the burial site for several minutes, listening. They could hear muffled sounds from below their father's attempts to call out the scratching of his hands against tarpaulin and earth. Satisfied that he was secured and suffering, they gathered their tools and went inside, closing the door on the March night, and the man buried in their yard. Inside the farmhouse, according to later investigation, the sons conducted themselves with disturbing normally. They prepared food, ate their evening meal, cleaned the dishes. They stoked the fire in the hearth, arranged sleeping spaces, conducted the routines of bedtime as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The absence of their father was not discussed. The sounds that might have carried from the burial site were ignored or unheard. Silas, buried 4 feet beneath Pennsylvania soil, endured his first night entombed. The tarpaulin had created a small void around his face, enough to breathe, but barely enough to move. The weight of the earth pressed down on him from all sides, inducing panic that he fought desperately to control. He could hear nothing from above, no voices, no sounds that might indicate rescue. The cold seeped into his body, the moisture from the earth soaking through his clothing. Hypothermia beginning its slow work. He tried calling out, but the earth absorbed his voice, turning his cries into muffled sounds that wouldn't carry more than a few feet. To understand how a family could reach the point where sons buried their father alive, we must examine the decades that preceded March 11th, 1879, and the slow accumulation of damage that can occur when bloodlines turn inward and isolation becomes absolute. The Cunningham family's troubles began, as mentioned, with Ezra's decision to allow or encourage the marriage between his children Josiah and Rebekah. Whether this was a practical decision born of isolation, a deliberate choice rooted in beliefs about keeping bloodlines pure, or simply the result of too much proximity in too confined a space, the consequences were biological and psychological. Silas, the product of that union, showed fewer obvious physical abnormalities than his own sons would later display, but those who knew him in his youth reported that he was slow to learn, quick to anger, and unsuited to normal society. He received minimal education. The remote location of the farm meant no regular school attendance, and his own parents' limited literacy couldn't provide much instruction. By adolescence, Silas had essentially become a laborer on his own family's property, following his father's instructions without questioning, developing few independent thoughts or ambitions. When Silas's father, Josiah, died in 1842, leaving 20-year-old Silas to manage the farm. The young man found himself overwhelmed by responsibilities he wasn't equipped to handle. The property began deteriorating. Fences went unrepaired, fields lay out, livestock wandered. Local farmers who visited reported finding Silas in states of confusion, unable to make basic decisions about planting or harvest timing, surviving more through luck than skill. The marriage to Martha Yoda in 1845 was arranged through Martha's father, who owned the general store in Oyola Mills and knew the Cunningham property needed a woman's management. Martha was 19, Silas 23. The marriage was not a love match. Martha's father essentially sold her into the union in exchange for Silas settling long-standing debts to the store. Martha's early letters to her sister, preserved in family collections and later entered as evidence, painted disturbing picture of life on the Cunningham farm. She described Silas as childlike in his thinking, ruled by moods that shift like weather and frightened of any change or challenge to his routine. She wrote of the isolation, weeks passing without seeing another soul, the silence of the farmhouse, the way Silas would sometimes disappear into the woods for days at a time, returning filthy and disoriented. The births of the three sons, Josiah in 1848, Caleb in 1851, and Nehemiah in 1855, brought additional strain. Martha's letters noted that each child showed peculiar development with delays in walking and talking, unusual physical features apparent from infancy, and behaviors that troubled her. She wrote to her sister about seeking medical advice, but the nearest doctor was in Phillipsburg, a day's travel over bad roads, and Silas refused to allow anyone outside the family to examine the boys. By 1858, Martha's letters had taken on a desperate tone. She described feeling trapped, unable to leave because she had nowhere to go with 3 young children, but increasingly convinced that something was fundamentally wrong with the family she had married into. Her final letter, written just weeks before her death, mentioned discovering things about Silas's family that explain much but make everything worse. Though she didn't specify what she had learned, Martha's death was officially attributed to pneumonia, but the doctor who examined her body noted unusual bruising and signs of prolonged malnutrition that suggested neglect or worse. However, in rural Pennsylvania in 1858, the death of a farmer's wife from illness wasn't uncommon enough to warrant investigation, especially on a remote property where witnesses were scarce. After Martha's death, the Cunningham household descended further into dysfunction. Silas, never equipped to be a single parent, raised his 3 sons with a combination of harsh discipline and neglect. The boys received almost no formal education. Silas could barely read himself and made no effort to teach them beyond basic survival skills. They learned farming by doing, learned speech from their limited interactions with each other and their father, learned social norms, not at all. As the boys grew through childhood and adolescence, their physical and mental abnormalities became more pronounced. Josiah's cognitive development lagged significantly. By age 10, he functioned at the level of a much younger child, able to perform simple tasks through imitation, but unable to reason through problems or understand abstract concepts. Caleb showed more capability, but struggled with emotional regulation, alternating between withdrawn silence and explosive outbursts. Nehemiah, the youngest, developed the most normally, but with a calculating quality that suggested he understood more than he revealed. The boys' isolation meant they formed their primary attachments to each other rather than to their father. They developed their own communication patterns, a mixture of standard English, invented words and gestures that functioned almost as a private language. They worked together efficiently when performing farm tasks, but showed little ability to interact with outsiders on the rare occasions when contact occurred. Wilhelm Hofmeister, the neighboring farmer, recalled one incident from around 1068, when he encountered the three Cunningham boys working in a field near the property line. He attempted friendly conversation, asking about their father's health and offering to lend equipment for the harvest. The boys stared at him without responding, their expressions so strange and their silence so complete that Hofmeister eventually retreated, unnerved by the encounter. He later testified that the boys seemed more like wild animals than proper Christian children. A harsh assessment, but one he stood by. As the sons entered adulthood, the question of their futures became increasingly problematic. In normal circumstances, young men would leave their father's household to seek work, establish their own families, build independent lives. But the Cunningham sons lacked the social skills, education, and probably the mental capacity to function in normal society. They were trapped on the farm by their limitations, and Silas was trapped with them by his responsibility and his own inability to imagine alternatives. The decade of the 1870s brought escalating tensions. The sons, now physically mature and strong from farm labor, no longer feared their father's physical punishments. Silas's authority rested increasingly on psychological control rather than force. He controlled access to the outside world, managed what little money the farm generated, made all decisions about purchases and sales. The sons began to chafe under this control, especially as they became aware that other men their age lived differently, had wives, owned property, made their own choices. Nehemiah, who occasionally accompanied his father to the general store, observed other families with growing resentment. He saw men younger than himself who owned their own farms, who spoke confidently with storekeepers who were treated with respect by the community. He became increasingly aware of how others looked at the Cunningham family with pity, disgust, or fear, and understood that his family's reputation prevented any possibility of normal social integration. The sons began discussing their situation among themselves, conversations their father wasn't privy to. They talked about leaving, about claiming their share of the property, about forcing their father to give them independence. But they also understood, at least dimly, that they were ill-equipped for life beyond the farm. Their unusual appearances would mark them anywhere they went. Their limited education and social skills would make finding work difficult, and the family's dark reputation, if it followed them, would close many doors. By the winter of 1,078, the situation had become untenable. The sons were in their late 20s and early 30s, long past the age when men typically left their father's household. Silas was nearing 60, his health declining, his ability to manage the farm diminishing. The property itself was failing, fences collapsing, fields exhausted from decades of poor management, buildings deteriorating. Everyone in the household understood that change was coming, but no one knew what form it would take. The harsh winter conditions accelerated the crisis. Confined to the farmhouse for weeks at a time, unable to escape each other's presence, the family's dysfunctions became magnified. Small irritations festered into major grievances. Old resentments resurfaced, and in Nehemiah's calculating mind, a plan began forming, a way to resolve their situation that drew on the very isolation and secrecy that had created their problems in the first place. While Silas Cunningham lay buried behind his own root cellar, fighting for each breath beneath 4 ft of Pennsylvania earth, his 3 sons conducted themselves in ways that would later provide crucial evidence about their mental states and motivations. The first full day after the burial, March 12, 1879, began normally on the Cunningham farm. Josiah, Caleb, and Nehemiah rose at dawn as usual, ate a breakfast of cornmeal mush, and went about their daily tasks. Josiah fed the few remaining chickens and checked on the pigs. Caleb chopped firewood to replenish their dwindling supply. Nehemiah worked in the house, cleaning dishes and organizing supplies. But there were differences, subtle changes that suggested the sons were not entirely comfortable with what they had done. All 3 made excuses to avoid the area near the root cellar where their father lay buried. When tasks required them to pass near the site, they hurried past without looking at the disturbed earth. They worked in unusual silence, even for a family accustomed to limited conversation. By afternoon of the first day, the sons gathered in the main room of the farmhouse for a discussion. Nehemiah, as the most articulate, led the conversation. He proposed that they tell any visitors their father had left on foot for Phillipsburg to purchase supplies and hadn't returned. A plausible story given that Silas occasionally made such trips, though rarely in winter. They rehearsed their story, ensuring all three could repeat it consistently. But a problem emerged that none of them had fully anticipated. Silas wasn't dying as quickly as they had expected. They could hear sounds from the burial site when they ventured near. Muffled cries, scratching noises, indications that their father remained alive beneath the earth. The tarpaulin and air pocket they'd created, intended to prolong his suffering for perhaps a day, were actually sustaining him longer than planned. This created a moral dilemma, at least for Josiah and Caleb. The initial act of burial had been carried out in anger, a ritualized punishment that felt justified in the heat of their confrontation. But as hours turned into a full day and their father's suffering continued, even their limited empathy began stirring. Josiah, in particular, showed signs of distress, pacing the farmhouse, muttering to himself, occasionally approaching the door as if to go outside and undo what they had done. Nehemiah worked to maintain his brothers' resolve. He reminded them of their father's cruelties, real and imagined. He painted visions of their future lives once Silas was gone. They would inherit the property, could sell it and split the proceeds, could start fresh in a new place where no one knew their history. He appealed to their sense of grievance, keeping their anger focused on their father rather than their own actions. The second night brought a new horror. Around midnight, all three brothers were awakened by a sound that seemed to come from beneath the ground itself. A low, rhythmic thumping like someone pounding weakly on a door. The sound was faint but undeniable, carrying through the cold March air into the farmhouse. Josiah wanted to dig their father up immediately, but Nehemiah prevented him, arguing that they had gone too far to turn back now. The third day, March 13th, dawned cold and clear. The thumping sounds from the burial site had stopped sometime before dawn, and the silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. The sons ventured closer to the site, listening carefully, but heard nothing. They tried to convince themselves that Silas had finally died, that their ordeal was over. But they couldn't be entirely sure, and none of them wanted to dig up the grave to check. It was during this third day that fate intervened in the form of three neighboring farmers, Wilhelm Hofmeister, his eldest son Johann, and a hired man named Thomas Byrne. They had been surveying property lines in preparation for spring planting when they found themselves near the Cunningham property. Deciding to check on the family after the harsh winter, they approached the farmhouse. The Cunningham sons' reaction to unexpected visitors was poorly managed. Nehemiah met the neighbors on the front porch, blocking entry to the house in a way that immediately aroused suspicion. When asked about Silas's whereabouts, Nehemiah delivered the rehearsed story about a trip to Phillipsburg, but his delivery was wooden, unconvincing. His brothers stood behind him in the doorway, their expressions anxious in ways that suggested guilt rather than simple social awkwardness. Wilhelm Hofmeister, experienced in reading men and situations, sensed immediately that something was wrong. He pressed for more details when had Silas left, by what route, for what purpose, given that the winter had barely broken. Nehemiah's answers became increasingly evasive and contradictory. At one point, Caleb interjected with a detail that contradicted what Nehemiah had just said, then fell silent when his younger brother glared at him. The conversation was interrupted by the sound all five men heard simultaneously, a low, muffled cry coming from somewhere behind the farmhouse. The Cunningham brothers claimed it was wind or a distant animal, but Hofmeister's group exchanged glances that showed they didn't believe it. When Hofmeister suggested they search the property to make sure nothing was wrong, Nehemiah refused, ordering the visitors off the property in language that was both desperate and threatening. The three visitors retreated, but didn't leave the area entirely. Instead, they positioned themselves out of sight of the farmhouse and waited, watching to see what the Cunningham sons would do. What they witnessed over the next hour convinced them that intervention was necessary. The three brothers emerged from the house, repeatedly approaching and then retreating from an area near the root cellar, their body language suggesting intense anxiety and disagreement. Wilhelm Hofmeister made a decision. He sent his son Jan on horseback to Oscola Mills to fetch the county sheriff, while he and Thomas Byrne remained to monitor the situation. If Silas Cunningham was indeed missing under suspicious circumstances, the authorities needed to be involved. And if something else was going on, something that explained the strange behavior and the muffled sounds, that too needed investigation. The Cunningham brothers, watching from the farmhouse windows, understood they had been observed. Nehemiah argued for maintaining their story, insisting the neighbors had no proof of wrongdoing, but Josiah's resolve had crumbled completely. He kept repeating, "We have to dig him up, we have to dig him up," his voice rising toward panic. Caleb wavered between his brothers, unable to decide which course to follow. The argument among the brothers escalated into physical confrontation. Nehemiah tried to physically restrain Josiah from leaving the house. Josiah, larger and stronger despite his mental limitations, broke free and ran toward the burial site. Nehemiah and Caleb chased after him, and the three brothers converged on the area near the root cellar where their father had been buried 3 days earlier. It was at this moment, around 2:00 on the afternoon of March 13th, that Wilhelm Hofmeister and Thomas Byrne approached again, ignoring the property boundaries and the brothers' earlier warnings. They arrived at the root cellar area just as Josiah began frantically digging with his bare hands at the disturbed earth, throwing dirt aside in desperate scoops while Nehemiah tried to pull him away. Hofmeister demanded to know what was buried there. Nehemiah, realizing the situation had spiraled beyond control, simply stood silent. Defeated, Josiah continued digging, now joined by Caleb, who had apparently decided to help. And then, as the hole deepened to about 2 ft, they all heard it. A faint scratching sound from beneath the remaining earth and a muffled voice that was unmistakably human calling for help. The next minutes unfolded in chaos. Hofmeister and Byrne joined the digging, working with the Cunningham brothers to excavate the grave as quickly as possible. They found the tarpaulin about 3 ft down, pulled it aside, and discovered Silas Cunningham alive barely, his face covered in soil, his eyes wild with terror and relief, his hands bloodied from 3 days of scratching at the earth above him. They pulled Silas from the grave and carried him into the farmhouse, laying him near the fire to warm him. His condition was critical: severe hypothermia, dehydration, possible suffocation damage, psychological trauma that left him unable to speak coherently for several hours. But he was alive against all odds, sustained by the air pocket that his sons had inadvertently made large enough to keep him breathing for 3 days. The Cunningham brothers did not attempt to flee or resist. They sat in various corners of the farmhouse, Josiah weeping openly, Caleb staring at nothing, Nehemiah with an expression that suggested he was already calculating what story might minimize their culpability. When Sheriff Daniel McKay arrived from Oyola Mills around 4:00 that afternoon, accompanied by 2 deputies and a local doctor, the scene he found was surreal: a nearly dead man being tended by his would-be murderers while witnesses stood guard to prevent any violence. The immediate aftermath of Silas Cunningham's rescue created a situation unlike anything Clearfield County had experienced before. Here was an attempted murder, but the victim and perpetrators were bound by blood and decades of shared isolation in ways that made standard legal procedures seem inadequate. Sheriff McKay faced the question of what to do with 4 men whose relationships and behaviors defied normal understanding. Silas was transported to the home of Dr. Frederick Steinman in Oyola Mills for medical treatment. His physical injuries were extensive but not immediately life-threatening. Frostbite on his fingers and toes, severe dehydration, respiratory problems from breathing damp earth-laden air for 3 days, countless small cuts and abrasions from his struggles. But the psychological damage was profound. For the first 2 days after his rescue, Silas could not speak coherently, alternating between catatonic silence and incoherent babbling that suggested his mind had partially broken under the trauma. The three sons were taken into custody and held in the small jail in Clearfield, the county seat. They were placed in separate cells to prevent collusion, though the jailers reported that the brothers seemed more concerned with calling out to each other than with planning their defense. Josiah, in particular, exhibited severe distress at the separation, crying and calling for his brothers like a young child separated from parents. As Silas's condition improved enough to allow questioning, Sheriff McKay began the difficult process of extracting his testimony. What emerged over several days of careful interviews was a story that explained much but left many questions unanswered. Silas described the confrontation on March 11th, the escalating argument about food and authority, his son's decision to bury him as punishment for what they saw as a lifetime of wrongs. But when McKay pressed for details about those alleged wrongs, Silas became evasive. The sheriff, experienced in reading evasion, sensed that Silas was hiding something, some aspect of family history or household dynamics that would contextualize the son's actions. McKay began investigating the Cunningham family history independently, interviewing neighbors, examining county records, piecing together the genealogy that explained so much about the son's unusual appearance and limited capabilities. What McKay discovered disturbed him profoundly. The marriage record between Josiah Cunningham, the elder, and Rebecca Cunningham, which listed them with the same surname, but gave no indication of their relationship. The absence of any record of Silas's mother before her marriage to Josiah, the pattern of physical and mental abnormalities in the sons that medical experts would later attribute to hereditary degeneration resulting from consanguineous breeding. McKay faced an ethical and legal dilemma. Pennsylvania law in 1879 prohibited marriage between close, B-blood relatives, but enforcement was spotty, especially in remote areas where family privacy was respected, and official record-keeping was minimal. The Cunningham family's incestuous relationships predated most formal statutes, occurring in a time and place where such matters were handled through social ostracism rather than legal action. But the consequences of those relationships, three men whose mental and physical conditions raised questions about their legal competency, now stood accused of attempted murder. The county prosecutor, James Hartwell, arrived from Clearfield to assess whether the case could be successfully prosecuted. He interviewed the sons separately, and his notes from those interrogations reveal the complexity of their mental states. Josiah could barely articulate why they had buried their father, responding to questions with fragmented sentences and circular reasoning that suggested genuine cognitive impairment. Caleb provided more detail, but seemed unable to understand why their actions were criminal, insisting repeatedly that they had only done what their father deserved. Nee alone showed clear understanding of the gravity of their situation, but his responses were calculated to minimize their culpability, suggesting that their father's abuse and their own mental limitations had driven them to an act they now regretted. The question of the son's competency to stand trial became central to the case. Dr. Steinman, who had treated Silas, was asked to examine the sons and provide a medical opinion on their mental fitness. His report filed with the court on March 25, 1879, was a remarkable document for its time. Steinman described in clinical detail the physical abnormalities he observed in each son, then attempted to correlate these with behavioral and cognitive deficits. He noted Josiah's marked mental deficiency, inability to reason abstractly, and emotional instability consistent with feeble-mindedness. He described Caleb as possessing greater functional capacity, but showing signs of moral insensibility and limited impulse control. Nehemiah he assessed as the most capable intellectually, but showing evidence of calculating self-interest that suggests understanding of right and wrong sufficient for legal responsibility. Steinman's report included a section that shocked even experienced legal professionals. His analysis of the family's genealogical history and the medical consequences of sustained inbreeding He wrote, "The physical characteristics observed in the accused strongly suggest they are the products of consanguineous relationships spanning at least 2 generations. The accumulation of deleterious hereditary traits has resulted in conditions ranging from severe mental deficiency to more subtle impairments of judgment and emotional regulation. While such individuals may be capable of complex physical tasks and show certain forms of intelligence, their moral and social development has been profoundly compromised." The medical terminology was crude by later standards, but Steinman's assessment raised fundamental questions about criminal responsibility. If the son's actions resulted from mental impairments caused by their family's incestuous history, conditions they did not choose and could not have prevented, were they fully culpable for their crime, or did their diminished capacity warrant different treatment under the law? Meanwhile, Silas's recovery progressed slowly. By early April, he could speak normally again, though he showed signs of lasting psychological trauma, nightmares, sudden panics when in enclosed spaces, and inability to tolerate darkness. He was reluctant to provide formal testimony against his sons, despite the prosecutor's insistence. When pressed about why he hesitated to see them prosecuted, Silas made a statement that illuminated the family's twisted dynamics. "They are my sons, and I am their father. What made them this way? That's my responsibility, too. We're all trapped by what our blood has become." This statement prompted further investigation into Silas's own culpability in his son's conditions. Had he knowingly engaged in incestuous relationships that produced children he knew would be impaired? The evidence suggested not. Silas's marriage to Martha Yoda was legitimate, and there was no indication he had fathered children with anyone else. But his decision to raise his impaired sons in complete isolation, denying them education or social contact that might have improved their functioning, raised questions about parental neglect that contributed to their eventual violence. The case attracted attention beyond Clearfield County. Newspapers in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh ran stories about the buried alive farmer and his degenerate sons, mixing sensationalism with genuine concern about the social and medical issues the case raised. Medical journals requested permission to examine the sons as examples of hereditary degeneration. Social reformers argued the case demonstrated the need for better monitoring of isolated rural families and regulation of marriages between close relatives. Public opinion was divided. Some viewed the sons as monsters who had attempted to murder their own father in cold blood and deserved the harshest punishment available. Others saw them as tragic figures, victims of circumstances beyond their control, whose limited understanding and decades of isolation had warped their judgment to the point where they genuinely believed burying their father was justified punishment rather than attempted murder. A few voices, though they were in the minority, suggested that Silas himself bore responsibility for creating the conditions that led to his burial. The trial of Josiah Caleb and Nehemiah Cunningham began on May 15, 1879, in the Clearfield County Courthouse. Judge Samuel Krebs presided over proceedings that would last 2 weeks and generate a transcript exceeding 500 pages. The courtroom was packed throughout, local residents drawn by morbid curiosity, reporters from urban newspapers, medical professionals interested in the hereditary aspects of the case, and legal observers wondering how the court would handle questions of diminished capacity in such an extreme situation. The prosecution, led by James Hartwell, presented a straightforward case. They called Wilhelm Hofmeister and Thomas Barn to describe finding Silas buried and the brother's suspicious behavior. They brought Dr. Steinman to describe Silas's physical condition when rescued and the medical evidence that he had been buried alive for approximately 3 days. They entered into evidence the shovel found near the burial site, the tarpaulin pulled from the grave, and photographs of the excavation site that showed the depth and deliberation of the hole. Most dramatically, they called Silas himself to testify. The courtroom fell silent as the 57-year-old farmer, still gaunt and weakened from his ordeal, took the stand. In a quiet voice that sometimes broke with emotion, Silas recounted the events of March 11th through 13th, the argument that escalated into violence, his son's decision to bury him, the 3 days of darkness and terror beneath the earth, the moment he heard digging above him and realized he might survive after all. Under cross-examination by the defense attorney, Harold Bingham, Silas was forced to address the conditions that had led to the confrontation. Bingham pressed him about his family history, the isolation he had imposed on his sons, the lack of education or social contact, the harsh discipline he had employed. Silas admitted to striking his sons when they were children, to controlling every aspect of their lives, to preventing them from leaving the farm or establishing independent lives. But he maintained that everything he had done was motivated by necessity, the need to protect his sons from a world that would reject them, to prevent outsiders from discovering family secrets that would bring shame, to hold together a household that was always on the brink of collapse. The defense strategy centered on diminished capacity. Bingham called Dr. Steinman back to the stand to elaborate on his assessment of the son's mental conditions. Steinman testified that Josiah was profoundly mentally deficient, functioning at a level significantly below his chronological age, unable to form complex plans or understand abstract moral principles. Caleb, he said, showed moderate mental impairment combined with emotional dysregulation that severely limited his judgment and impulse control. Nehemiah was the most capable of the three, but showed evidence of moral reasoning deficits and limited ability to anticipate consequences. Bingham argued that men with such severe cognitive and emotional impairments could not form the intent necessary for a murder conviction. They had not planned to kill their father. The air pocket they created in the grave proved they intended him to survive, at least temporarily. Their action was a bizarre punishment arising from limited understanding and decades of abuse, not a calculated murder attempt. He pointed out that when confronted by neighbors, Josiah had immediately wanted to dig his father up, showing that whatever limited plan they had formed could not withstand even mild external pressure. The prosecution counted that Nehemiah at least showed clear understanding of right and wrong. His attempts to maintain a cover story to prevent his brothers from excavating Silas prematurely and to calculate responses during police interrogation all demonstrated sufficient capacity for criminal intent. Even if Josiah and Caleb were impaired, Nehemiah had directed their actions and should be held fully responsible. The trial's most dramatic moment came when all three sons testified. Josiah was nearly incomprehensible on the stand, responding to questions with fragmented sentences and sometimes lapsing into what sounded like a private language he shared with his brothers. His testimony was painful to witness. A grown man with the mental capacity of perhaps a 7- or 8-year-old child trying to explain actions he clearly didn't fully understand, becoming increasingly distressed until the judge mercifully ended his testimony early. Caleb did better, but still struggled to articulate his reasoning. When asked why they had buried their father rather than simply forcing him to leave or seeking help from authorities, Caleb could only repeat that he had it coming and we did what needed doing. Under persistent questioning about whether he understood that burying someone alive could kill them, Caleb eventually said yes, but then immediately contradicted himself by saying they had made sure their father could breathe, suggesting genuine confusion about the relationship between their actions and potential outcomes. Nehemiah's testimony was the most coherent and therefore the most damning. He clearly understood the gravity of what they had done. He acknowledged that burying someone alive was wrong, but he insisted that decades of abuse and their father's refusal to give them any independence had left them with no other option they could see. He described feeling trapped, unable to imagine a future where they could escape their father's control or their own limitations. The burial, he claimed, was an act of desperation, not premeditated murder. Under cross-examination, Hartwell destroyed Nehemiah's credibility by revealing inconsistencies in his story and demonstrating that Nehemiah had tried to manipulate his brothers into maintaining silence even after neighbors became suspicious. "You knew what you did was wrong," Hartwell stated. "You knew it was a crime. You knew your father might die. You knew you would hang if caught, and you did it anyway, then tried to cover it up. That is not desperation. That is calculated malice." The jury deliberated for 3 days, an unusually long time that suggested serious disagreement about the appropriate verdict. When they finally returned on May 30th, 1879, their decision reflected the case's complexity. They found Josiah not guilty by reason of insanity, determining that his mental deficiencies were so profound that he could not form criminal intent. They found Caleb guilty of attempted murder, but recommended mercy, acknowledging his diminished capacity as a mitigating factor. And they found Nehemiah guilty of attempted murder without recommendation for mercy, concluding that he possessed sufficient understanding to be held fully responsible for his actions. Judge Krebs's sentencing, delivered on June 3, 1879, attempted to balance justice with compassion for men whose lives had been shaped by circumstances beyond their control. Josiah was committed to the Pennsylvania State Lunatic Hospital at Harrisburg for indefinite confinement, where doctors might attempt treatment, though none expected much improvement. Caleb received 10 years at hard labor in the Eastern State Penitentiary, with the judge noting that while the defendant's capacity was diminished, he retained sufficient understanding to merit punishment, though not the maximum the law allows. Nehemiah received 25 years at hard labor, with the judge stating that the defendant's intelligence and calculated attempts to conceal the crime demonstrate a level of culpability that requires significant punishment. Though the court acknowledges the hereditary and environmental factors that contributed to his moral failings, Silas sat through the sentencing with tears streaming down his face. When given the opportunity to address the court, he simply said, "I forgive them. They're my sons. I should have done better by them. We all should have done better." The dispersal of the Cunningham family after the trial marked the end of a bloodline that had turned toxic through generations of isolation and inbreeding. The farm itself was sold at auction to pay legal debt, purchased by a neighboring family who tore down the old farmhouse and built a new structure on a different part of the property, as if physical distance from the site of tragedy might erase what had happened there. Silas Cunningham never fully recovered from his ordeal, though his physical injuries healed. He lived for another 3 years, staying with various relatives of his late wife Martha, who took him in out of Christian charity. He worked occasionally as a day laborer, but struggled with the lasting psychological effects of his burial, panic attacks in enclosed spaces, nightmares that woke him screaming, and inability to be alone after dark. He died in 1882 at age 60, officially of pneumonia, but more truthfully of a broken spirit that had given up on life. Josiah Cunningham spent the rest of his life at the State Lunatic Hospital. Hospital records describe a patient who never adjusted to institutionalization, who remained confused about why he had been separated from his brothers, who occasionally became violent when attendants tried to move him from familiar spaces. He died in 1891 at age 43, the cause listed as complications from influenza, though his caretakers noted he had essentially stopped eating several weeks before his death, as if he had simply lost the will to continue. Caleb served his full 10-year sentence at Eastern State Penitentiary, a place designed for criminal reformation that was particularly ill-suited for someone with his limitations. Prison records describe him as a difficult inmate, not violent, but unable to follow complex instructions, prone to emotional outbursts when frustrated, requiring constant supervision to prevent him from wandering into dangerous areas. He was released in 1889 at age 38, returned briefly to Clearfield County, then disappeared from historical record. Rumors placed him in various locations over the years, working at a lumber camp in northern Pennsylvania, living rough in the coal regions, dying in a mining accident sometime in the 1890s. But none of these reports could be confirmed. Nehemiah showed the most adaptation to incarceration, which was consistent with his greater intelligence. He learned prison routines quickly, found work in the prison workshop manufacturing shoes, and kept mostly to himself. He was neither popular nor particularly troublesome, existing in a gray zone of minimal engagement with his surroundings. Prison chaplain's notes describe occasional conversations with Nehemiah about his crime, in which he expressed remorse that seemed genuine, but also oddly detached, as if he was discussing events that happened to someone else. Nehemiah was released in 1904 after serving his full 25 years. He was 49 years old. his unusual features now marked additionally by decades of hard labor and poor prison conditions. He returned to Clearfield County briefly, but the community that had watched his trial made clear he was not welcome. He moved on, and like his brother Caleb, largely vanished from official records. The last confirmed sighting placed him in Pittsburgh in 1908, living in a rooming house and working as a night watchman at a warehouse. He would have been 53 after that. Nothing. No death record, no further employment history, no indication of what became of him. The Cunningham case had lasting impacts beyond the immediate participants. It prompted Pennsylvania to strengthen laws prohibiting marriages between close blood relatives with specific penalties for violations. It led to increased attention to isolated rural families with county officials, empowered to investigate reports of abuse or neglect in remote homesteads. It became a case study in legal discussions about diminished capacity and hereditary mental illness cited in court decisions for decades afterward. Medical professionals used the case to advance understanding of the effects of inbreeding. Dr. Steinman published a detailed paper in a Philadelphia medical journal in 1880, using the Cunningham brothers as examples of hereditary degeneration and arguing for public health measures to prevent consanguineous marriages. His work, while crude by modern standards, represented early recognition that certain genetic conditions could be passed through families and intensified by intermarriage. The case also entered local folklore in ways that distorted and sensationalized what had actually happened. Stories circulated about the cannibal brothers of Clearfield County, the devil's children who buried their father, and other embellishments that bore little relation to the actual events. These stories served various purposes: cautionary tales about the dangers of isolation, justifications for community interference in family privacy, entertainment for those who enjoyed Gothic horror, but they obscured the human tragedy at the core of the story. A family destroyed by poverty, ignorance, and the biological consequences of sustained inbreeding, none of which the sons had chosen. In the decades that followed, the burial site itself became a point of morbid interest. Though the farmhouse was demolished and the land put to different use, locals knew the approximate location where Silas had been buried alive. Stories emerged of strange sounds heard near the site, of animals refusing to cross certain ground, of crops that wouldn't grow where the grave had been dug. These supernatural embellishments were almost certainly false, products of imagination and the human tendency to make legends from tragedies, but they persisted nonetheless. The legal documents from the case, trial transcripts, medical reports, sentencing statements were sealed by court order in 1885, officially to protect the privacy of the surviving family members, but also because the details were considered too disturbing for public consumption. The documents remained sealed for nearly a century, finally being opened to historical researchers in 1979, exactly 100 years after the events they described. What those documents revealed when finally examined was a story more complex and tragic than the simplified versions that had circulated for decades. They showed a family trapped by circumstances largely beyond their control. Poverty that prevented them from seeking help, social isolation that meant they had no external perspective on their situation, genetic damage from inbreeding that occurred before they were born, and a legal system ill-equipped to handle cases where diminished capacity complicated questions of criminal responsibility. The Cunningham case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about blame and responsibility. Were Josiah, Caleb, and Nehemiah monsters who attempted to murder their father? Or were they victims of a system, biological, social, and legal, that created conditions for tragedy? Was Silas a cruel father who got what he deserved? Or was he himself a victim of hereditary damage and poverty, doing the best he could with limited capacity? And what responsibility did the broader community bear for allowing a family to exist in such isolation that its dysfunctions could intensify to the point of attempted murder? The answers are not simple, and perhaps that's the most important lesson from the Cunningham tragedy. The sons were not supernatural monsters. They were damaged men who committed a terrible crime under circumstances that make simple moral judgments inadequate. Their story is a reminder that horror doesn't require ghosts or demons. Sometimes the most disturbing stories are the entirely human ones, where ordinary people make terrible choices for reasons that are explicable, if not excusable, and where the line between victim and perpetrator becomes so blurred that distinguishing between them feels impossible. The last known person with direct knowledge of the Cunningham case was Margaret Hofmeister, daughter of Willem Hofmeister, who had helped rescue Silas. She lived until 1953, dying at age 94. In an interview given to a local historian in 1948, she recalled her father's stories about the Cunningham family and the rescue. "My father said it was the most terrible thing he'd ever seen," she reported. Not just the man in the ground, though that was awful enough, but the look on those boys' faces when they were digging him out. They looked lost, like children who'd done something bad, but didn't really understand why it was bad. That's what haunted him the rest of his life. Not the cruelty of it, but the confusion. They really didn't understand what they'd done wrong. And perhaps that confusion, that gap between action and understanding, is the real horror at the heart of the Cunningham story. 3 men who buried their father alive, then couldn't quite grasp why that was wrong. A father who forgave them even as they faced punishment for trying to kill him. A community that didn't know whether to condemn the sons as criminals or pity them as victims. A legal system that struggled to apply concepts like guilt and responsibility to men whose capacity for moral reasoning had been compromised before they were born. The Cunningham farm is gone now, replaced by forest that has reclaimed what was once cleared land. The exact location of the burial site is forgotten, lost to time, and the changes that a century and a half brings to any landscape. The people involved are all dead, their descendants scattered or unaware of their connection to the events of 1879. The physical evidence has long since disappeared, the farmhouse demolished, the burial site grown over, the tools and artifacts scattered or destroyed. What remains is the story itself, preserved in court documents and newspaper accounts, in medical journals and legal precedents, in the fading memories of a community that has largely forgotten, but not quite erased, what happened on that isolated Pennsylvania farm. It's a story without clear heroes or simple villains, without supernatural elements or easy morals, just human beings, damaged, desperate, doing terrible things to each other in circumstances that make judgment difficult and sympathy uncomfortable. That's the real legacy of the Cunningham case. Not the sensational details of a man buried alive, but the harder truth that sometimes the most disturbing stories are the ones that could be explained if we had all the facts. If we understood all the context, if we could see clearly how damaged people make terrible choices. The horror isn't that we can't understand what happened at that Pennsylvania farm in 1879. The horror is that we can understand it all too well.